So, common misconception about us gay folk. People usually assume our happy place is something like when in reality is more akin to and that's exactly where Vermintide comes in for me, because this game makes me feel so goddamn. I never did care much about the Warhammer franchise, since it and its futuristic counterpart Warhammer 40k seem mostly focused on delivering high-quality real-time strategy titles. However, without even putting much thought into it, I saw the game during the Steam Winter Sale and just bought it. It, as well as all the bonus content and DLC available for it, cost just under $10, so there was no way for me to feel any buyer's remorse about it anyway. And oh my god, is this game fun! It's just so much fun! First of all, what is this even about? Well, as the name of its prequel, The End Times, implies, things aren't looking too rosy for the world. After the first game, an evil sorcerer guy called Rasknit and his rat and Viking friends were able to capture the 5 main characters, the heroes of Ubersreich, a city which fell in their absence. Rasknit has since been building a giant portal called the Skittergate, which would allow him to teleport giant armies of his Viking allies, the Rotbloods, to invade the rest of Helmgard, the game's main area. However, the Skittergate intermittently fails, preventing Bödvar from summoning his entire army. When the Skittergate disastrously fails to activate yet again, the resulting destruction frees one of the heroes, Marcus Kruber, from captivity, who is able to free the others, Victor Salspire, Bardin Gurickson, Sienna Fuegonasus, and Carillion. Together, they go on missions which can be selected or randomly played from the game's hub area. So one of the things I immediately just could not ignore is how damn beautiful this game looks. And this comes from someone who doesn't even like fantasy worlds usually. But the game boasts with maps that are brimming with detail both near and far. Not only are the large-scale battles technically impressive with how many enemies are often present on screen, almost making it a difficult and frightening Dynasty Warriors, the environment itself is always an eye-catcher. The game's skyboxes and vistas are truly something to behold, and not something I would have expected from a studio of relatively small size behind it. While, yes, the roads you take are relatively simplistic, there's jaw-dropping destruction happening all around you, level architecture changing, as well as the inherent charm of the Warhammer world permeating throughout. The game does its best to bring a variety of grim surroundings to life. It also has some truly impressive effects. There's special enemies, which will cover your screen in beautifully frightening green fire, as well as the characters themselves just coming up with all kinds of madness. The game strikes a careful balance here between readability and impressiveness, and I sadly don't think it quite gets it down. If you get caught in one of the specialist enemies' attacks, your screen will have a complete meltdown between shaking, red alerts from the direction you're taking your damage from, and the barrage of the enemies' attacks themselves. This is mostly noticeable in the warp fire thrower attacks. The fire can sometimes just be way too bright, and this leads to some moments of panic and confusion at the exact times there shouldn't be. Part of me wonders if this was intentional. However, I believe the game is at its best when it remains challenging and surprising but readable. This, granted rather small problem, also carries over to the abilities of the playable characters themselves, albeit to a much smaller extent. There are many abilities that feel a bit underwhelming visually, which does reflect their overall strength. There are, for example, multiple abilities that are simply a shout that affects nearby enemies or allies, and ones where your character simply dashes in a direction. These are on a low cooldown, so I'm not talking about balance here. They just seem a lot less impressive from the get-go. The character that swings into the complete opposite of this is Sienna. Sienna, in her different styles of pyromancy, can, just like the enemies I've mentioned before, create fire that is just way too bright and disorienting for the player. Part of me wonders if this can be alleviated by lowering the settings, but I don't think it's fair to be needing to lower settings to improve readability. There's one last small problem with readability. Since there are a plethora of attacks capable of knocking enemies to the floor, I sometimes find myself wondering if an enemy is dead or just knocked down. This is quickly resolved by giving them a jab, since dead enemies will just ragdoll and those who aren't will react accordingly. But in the masses, it can be possible to lose track of enemies you've knocked down versus killed. The game's toggleable gore will also sometimes be a bit much in the way it covers your screen, even if severing red body parts proves to be highly satisfying on repeat. These are all exceptions to the rule, however, because all other attacks and threats are perfectly telegraphed thanks to the on-point animation. Neither you attacking nor blocking will ever be instant, but your enemies can't do that either. This presents you with ample windows of opportunity, and the most devastating attacks will have long wind-up animations to boot. Maybe at first they seem unavoidable, but they are actually asking you to react in a direct way. It's crucial to know when an enemy will give you enough time to attack them to interrupt them, and when to just block or push them away. At first, the system of blocking and pushing away enemies in order to stagger them and open them up for attacks seemed annoying to me. I just wanted to keep chopping heads. But soon the beauty of it opened up. Its simple yet challenging system is also obviously accompanied with lots of satisfying animations. You can also dodge, which I've personally almost never utilized. I'm sure it has its uses, but the way it is implemented, currently it just presents itself as a short hop to the side, barely faster than just walking in that direction for most characters. Maybe the classes that strengthen dodging will change my mind on it eventually. However, the likely most useful tool in the game is simple awareness, which is helped by the game's excellent sound design. Not only will characters shout out the names of the special enemies they spot, but you will also be made aware of them by specific sound cues they provide as soon as they spawn in. Some will very accurately tell you where they are simply by their footsteps getting louder, while others act more in the realm of confusion. What is a constant is that it all sounds great. And considering how important of a feature in the game this is, I'm glad about how it turned out. In fact, the game loses a lot of its charm if you play it at too low of a volume or don't have it on at all, especially because you need to hear enemies behind you. The way spawning is handled in the game will never just teleport an enemy behind your back, but given that you sometimes may not see an enemy that isn't dead or just walk over them, it's important to be able to still hear them waiting to deliver vengeance on you. This is really well done too. The way different enemies scream at the top of their lungs before charging at you is soon met by the clanking of blades, the thud of wooden shields, and crunching of bones. It all sounds great, and really draws the player in. The game also sports some exciting music. There aren't many different tracks, but what is there really gets your blood pumping and body ready for the imminent onslaught. It also goes without saying, but the voice acting in the game is absolutely stellar. The actors are able to infuse their characters with as much wit and humor and dramatized moments as they are required in a script, and the interactions between them are always a joy to listen to. I really like the way classes are handled in this game. As mentioned earlier, there are 5 characters in total that have 3 subclasses each. In the beginning, I was a bit disappointed by this. While 5 classes are more than enough, I feared the variation between the subclasses wouldn't be interesting, except for maybe Sienna the Pyromancer, who will always wield some form of flame magic and be structured around avoiding overheating. All the other characters have insane variation between their forms. But first, let me explain what is usually seen as the different jobs players will need to perform on a given mission. Firstly, since there are only 4 players but 5 classes, this inherently creates some variance in which voices you'll hear on your quest, as well as what gameplay your party provides. Next, Players are set to perform one of the following 4 roles. One player should be a beefy frontline, capable of riding the sheer tides of enemies and striking them all down themselves, while keeping them away from the team. This is most akin to what might be called a tank in other games, while ironically doing the most killing. Next up, a sniper. These players should be able to quickly dispatch of special enemies as soon as they appear, usually equipped with lots of ammo or a high damage long-range weapon. Thirdly, a damage dealer. These players should specialize in being able to dish out loads of damage on a single target, highly effective against monsters and bosses. And lastly, a panic button. These players are a last resort. They should be able to improvise and salvage an otherwise lost mission. As you've probably already guessed, there absolutely is some overlap between these roles, and their non-rigid structure is what makes this game so exciting and ever different. Sure, the roles I've listed are what each player genuinely should be doing, but when push comes to shove, players need to be able to adapt quickly or die trying. This flexibility is, as I mentioned, perfectly expressed in the differences between classes. Kruber might be introduced to you as a frontline, specialized on fighting many enemies at the same time, but the next class you unlock for him makes him a deadly marksman with the ability to turn invisible and deal shockingly high headshot damage. The difference in what each class provides can be astounding, and it's helped by the plethora of passive perks they all possess from the moment you unlock them. This is different from talents, which are more akin to skills from a traditional skill tree. You'll be able to acquire a new talent every 5 character levels, which doesn't take all too long in the earlier levels, but later mounts up. Reaching a new level is never away more than 2 or 3 completed missions. These talents are what truly makes your given class shine, adding both inherent synergies or strengthening your playstyle. I just kind of wish some talent tiers weren't the same for every character. I understand why this was done, as there are practically essential talents, but it takes much away from making them feel distinct, and relies on you getting more accustomed to the base skills of the class first. Which does work, to be fair. With stuff like this that is identical across the board, it makes me wish it would have been offered as a base choice for the class and not as part of the progression system. However, this by no means ruins the system. It still has more than enough room to enable fun as well as strictly competitive builds for your characters. For some, this means generating an insane amount of ammo for hitting headshots, dealing increased critical damage, or even lowering the cooldown of their abilities to enable you to use them multiple times in a fight. As said earlier, while some classes might seem less exciting at first glance, they truly keep the gameplay fresh by providing a unique experience for every single one. I also appreciate greatly that although this is a fantasy game, there aren't any classes that fall into the trappings of boring multiplayer roles like tanks and healers. There are classes capable of supporting allies or reducing damage, but they do that in a much more subtle and fun to play way than what you might be used to. So now that we've talked about who these characters are, who even are the enemies you will be going up against? Well, the only real problem I have with this game, and unfortunate variety into the game, is the playable characters themselves. Yes, most of the time you will be hacking away at the horde mobs that come in the same model with just a few small variations. But the situations these enemies create will always keep you guessing, especially in higher difficulties. Also, these folks are just great to beat up on, especially if you hate rats for some reason, or have a problem with dirty Vikings. Personally, I get to live out my fantasy of getting revenge on the popular girl who bullied me in high school and was obsessed with her pet rats. That's right, Veronica, I didn't forget. So let's get into them a little bit more. The hordes come in. Slave rats, who are probably the easiest and least threatening enemies. They have slow, telegraphed attacks and are easily knocked down and killed. Clan rats, who come equipped with a spear with faster attacks and improved range. These also might carry a wooden shield protecting them from damage, but they can still be staggered and their shield can be broken. Fanatics, which are the same as the basic rats in human form and fittingly taller. Marauders are slightly more threatening than the rat counterpart, but with less range. These also come in shielded form. Now let's move on to elite enemies. Storm vermin can be some of the most problematic enemies. These heavily armored rats are faster than the others and can only be wounded on their heads, requiring not only aim, but also knowledge about your own melee weapon swings. They also can come with an unbreakable shield that can still be staggered and knocked down by classes specialized on that. Plague monks announce their presence with a high-pitched scream and are one of my favorites. They are fast running and will try to track you down only to start wailing on you, locking you in their flurry of attacks. The startup, however, is decently telegraphed with mediocre range, so an aware player will be able to deal with them before it comes to this. Maulers are taller, more resistant versions of Marauders. They aren't armored, but their slow attacks deal high damage and are difficult to interrupt. They also may kick you to interrupt your own attacks. The Savage is a human version of the Plague Monk, announcing their presence with a fearsome war cry. Just like the monks, they will try to run right at you and try to lock you into a combo with their war axes, with maybe slightly less range than the monks. Chaos Warriors are a personal nightmare. These tall and fully armored brutes can only be hurt by hitting them in the head and are completely unfazed by any other attacks except for explosions or abilities with stagger. These are aggressive, and while having clear attack patterns, they have devastating damage and range. Once they decide to attack you, you will be forced to think about how to protect your health. Because they are much taller than any playable character, swinging at their head proves to be quite the challenge every time, so ranged characters should be tasked with taking these down fast. Now let's move on to specials. These will always be announced by one of the playable characters as soon as they notice them. Well, unless they're drunk, that is. The Gutter Runner is likely the most common special. These agile rat assassins will travel along walls and vault through the air to launch themselves onto an unsuspecting player and pin them down to subject them with a swift slicing. Don't worry too much though, they are easily knocked off by any allied attack and can be dispatched after.
You're jealous. You are just like a rat, jumping around the corner looking for a food. Very jealous.
The Packmaster is a slow but threatening enemy equipped with a hook that will try to abduct the player, dragging them away from their allies and either subjecting them to more hurt by other enemies or impaling them in an isolated location. If this happens, the players will need to get the victim off the hook before they can be helped or revived, making this enemy much more time-intensive to deal with. In general, these two listed foes already should make clear the function of special enemies. They are in a way very much different forms of team awareness challenges. Sure, they can be dealt with alone, but one quick mistake and the player is helpless. Poison Wind Globadier will bomb players with toxic gas bombs, cutting off large areas of the playing field. This makes it a foe that needs to be dealt with immediately, as they can sabotage mission-critical places such as ladders or important objects. A Rattling Gunner is a bit easier to deal with. The players caught inside their storm of bullets may lose control over the character and take loads of damage for the duration, but as long as this is a tank, others will have more than enough time to take them out. Sack Rats merely carry a random assortment of items from loot dice to medikits with them, and will try to run away from players. The Warpfire Thrower is very similar to the Rattling Gunner, with maybe a shorter range. They essentially deal heavy damage and cover the player's screen, with the added threat of leaving a trail of warp fire on the ground. Blightstormers create tornadoes that knock up and swirl players around inside them. This might seem like a fun ride at first, until you land and are drained of both health and stamina, as well as slowed for a short duration. The tornado does point players toward its creator as it is being summoned though, so keen eyes will be able to snipe them away. Life Leeches pull a player in and hold them up, slowly draining their health and leaving them helpless. These enemies aren't very threatening, simply because their AI will often teleport them right into the middle of the party. Monsters are basically the bosses of this game, although there are some missions in which you will fight a unique boss right at the end. Bosses also surprisingly work pretty similar to each other, and don't possess the same completely unique behavior as specials. All bosses except for one will target a specific player and basically start whacking them until they are dead, draining them of stamina and knocking them around. This is usually the player hitting them with the most melee attacks. But they are able to recognize ranged threats as well. They all also possess a threatening punch walk. It can quickly deplete stamina while keeping a player inside their attack range. The Rat Ogre is a kind of proto-monster. It has no special behaviors. Bile Trolls have the additional attack of vomiting on players in a large forward area, covering their screen and draining stamina for a long time. They will also try to heal themselves by eating their own vomit, which leaves them exposed and makes for a very fun time landing free headshots. Stormfiends are probably the most adaptable monster, because they may choose to attack you from range. Just like a warp fire thrower on steroids, they will leave huge trails of damaging warp fire in their wake, sometimes completely trapping unprepared players. Their weak spot also isn't their head, but the rat controlling them on their back. Chaos Spawn have an additional attack where they will swing their tentacle in a wide area in order to grab a player and fling them around like that one horrible scene in Toy Story 3. They also may utilize the player to heal off of them. So, as you can tell, the enemies in the game are just as much the stars of the action as the characters themselves. But what methods do you have to get them on the old hurt train? Let's talk weapons. There are so many different kinds of weapons in the game. In fact, probably way too many to list here. Just know that there is some overlap in the weapons pool for some of the classes, so you will often be familiar with the moveset as you try out new characters. I was often surprised at how much the classes change the weapons the character can wield. What I thought was a designated archer turned out to suddenly find crossbows in the repertoire, or gunslingers will fall back to longswords and maces. It's honestly astounding, and makes me excited for classes to come. There are, of course, weapons unique to a specific class, like the throwing axes for the Slayer, or the dual-wielding axes, or the axes. These offer some great identity and flavor, but the weapons aren't just for show. In fact, they offer deep amounts of customizations and tactics. They all behave differently in the way they combo the swings of their light attacks and how their heavy attack is executed. And through my explanation of the combat system, you should know how much the speed, strength, and even the side in which you strike your enemies matters. Depending on the role you want to cover, a weapon with big range but slow attacks might be best for a tank in order to keep the enemy hordes at bay and cleave through them with ease, while a weapon with less range but faster and high damaging attacks is more suited for a class that specializes in dealing lots of damage up close to shred a boss. Some weapons may also be more suited in staggering enemies, or easier to deliver headshots with, in order to activate other equipped effects. The possibilities in experimentation and playstyles are plenty. All weapons also influence how many bars of stamina your character is provided with, adding yet another layer to considering your choice. We've covered classes, enemies, and weapons so far, but there is one essential factor to the never-ending motivation of the player left to dissect: the missions you are sent on. There are 13 included in the base game, 3 coming with a unique boss at the end of them, and 1 with a much harder final boss. To say they are varied is an understatement. These missions regularly wowed me with what was happening on the screen and what me and my friends were required to pull off. I described the environments and graphics section to just be pretty set pieces, and while that might be true, it isn't quite fair to what has actually been achieved here. The bombast of these backgrounds combines beautifully with the carnage of the actual gameplay. Sure, you may sometimes need to escort a ram to a certain gate, but you'll be rewarded with the howling of a horde of enemies waiting on the other side. There's missions taking place in the dark, ones where you hunt down and explode noxious pustules, or defend locations against hordes of enemies waiting for salvation. Sure, sometimes there isn't much complexity in what you're actually doing, with carrying around barrels before they explode probably being the peak in challenge and strategy. But missions that know they can't impress in this form will pull out the stops to bring explosive cinematography to life. There also is some small variance in how the missions will unfold in part. First and foremost, obviously, there is an inherent randomness in when and how enemies will try to hinder you. Only rarely is there a fixed boss spawning at a fixed time, and the game can and will overwhelm you at unexpected times. Other variables include some paths crumbling before you when you thought they led to safety, but this part of the game warrants much more exploration throughout missions to be added in the future. Also, each mission is hiding 3 tomes and 2 grimoires somewhere on the map. Tomes will cover the equip slot of your health potions, allowing you to only heal when you find a new one. And grimoires will not only take up the slot for strength, speed and focus potions, but will also permanently lock a considerable chunk of every player's max health. These add another variable of difficulty inside the missions themselves, and reward you with additional XP and better loot if you manage to complete a mission carrying them with you. They also contribute a large part of the game's mystique and flair. Sure, you could look up a guide where to find them all, but personally I never felt like doing so. Instead, you'll gain knowledge on the location naturally just by playing with others and letting them guide you to these coveted books. This will gradually make you remember where they are and increase your knowledge much more permanently than trying to watch and remember a YouTube video throughout all the chaos. Other items hidden throughout are usually bombs, ammo, and ravaged art, which are just collectibles. All of which spawn differently each time you start the mission, adding another layer of freshness to it. I don't think there's any straight up boring missions, and I appreciate that they all vary in both length and inherent difficulty, beyond the difficulty setting itself. You will also always be rewarded the same amount of experience points no matter the difficulty, and completing a mission will always feel rewarding, making the game very beginner friendly. The difficulty levels themselves are Recruit, Veteran, Champion, Legend, and the DLC difficulty Cataclysm. Recruit truly is only a beginner setting that you will likely abandon just after a few hours of play, while Veteran is what most people are comfortable with playing at. From Champion on, enemies need to be blocked, pushed, and staggered with great skill, as the threat they pose is major, and friendly fire for ranged attacks of all kinds is turned on for the players, forcing you to think thrice before throwing a bomb to try and freeze your tank from a tide of rats. The other settings merely increase enemies' toughness and further reduce the amount of items to be found. Crucially, the loot rewards do not increase in strength the higher the difficulty. Playing on Champion or higher merely grants you the chance to gain items of a higher, red-tinted rarity tier. And well, it's an online game, and you all should know what comes with that, right? People can be toxic, cause horrible lag, and create all sorts of tremendous mischief, while you're just trying to relax after a hard day. But that's just how online games are, and the game does try to lower these frustrations. Ever since I started playing around 3 months ago, there have been multiple updates to the behavior of bots, and generally speaking, people who are disconnected will get swapped out for a bot and back very quickly. The only real problem is when people don't disconnect, but just go AFK. If you're, for example, in front of a boss room and they don't enter it, you'll be completely locked out of progression. You can't really push them to where they need to trigger the boss, and they can't die because enemies will not spawn at that point.
Fuck this, I'm out of here. Get that fire exit door. I'm off.
The only real problem I have with this game, and unfortunately this grievance only grew the more and more I played it, is the lack of dedicated servers. This game, 3 years after release, is still very popular and yet works over peer-to-peer connection. Not only does this create slow load and connection times, but most annoyingly, if anything goes wrong and you are disconnected from the host, you will be kicked back at the start of the mission or right back to the base. And this can happen no matter at what point during the mission you are. And I think you can all imagine that when I'm right at the end of a mission, going for the finish line, I don't really want to go back to the start and repeat it all over. Alright, that's it for my thoughts on the base game. This is already my longest video ever, but we still have the DLC to cover, because I truly think it warrants just as much attention as the base content. Shadows over Bogenhaven is the first DLC for the game. It adds 2 missions in which our heroes will try to free the city of Bogenhaven of the corrupting presence of the Blight Reaper, a cursed sword that unleashed a plague. In the first mission, the Pit, you will at one point be challenged to defend a location in classic Call of Duty zombie style, including wooden planks to block out windows, which was a really fun idea. The second mission, the Blight Reaper, will task you with finding and stealing the titular sword as you find hidden switches in a library. Overall, these missions are solid and add fun new twists to established mechanics. The second DLC brings the heroes back to Uberstreik, where they are sent into remixed versions of missions from the first game. It also adds new, powerful melee weapon alternatives for your characters once you complete all 3 scenarios with them. This set of missions is, in my opinion, just as high quality as the last one, with the one fault being, however, that each one seems to have the tendency to trap the players in a large area with a rather hard to complete objective, while enemies constantly flood them until you are crushed if they don't complete their goal. In the mission titled Garden of More, this is fun. Cut the chains of the bell to be rewarded with extra mobility and an easy escape, since the floor isn't covered in acid anymore. But in Horn of Magnus, you are tasked with carrying 3 barrels across a courtyard to blow open a door while enemies try to interfere, coming from all directions. This doesn't sound too bad until you realize that once you or an enemy hit a barrel, they are irreversibly destined to explode, and you're surrounded by things that want to hit things. This short section can stretch a lot longer than probably even the devs expected it if you have a truly uncoordinated team. But overall, it's still manageable. However, when we come to Engines of War, this actually pretty cool all-in-all mission has the single most tilting section in the entire game. The players walk into a rat war camp and are tasked with carrying 3 barrels from the center area to specific points in the camp in order to blow them up. Different from the part I just mentioned, the camp is huge and sprawling, but with much tighter passages. Enemies can not only appear from everywhere, but also climb down from the walls beside you or jump out of a dark corner. Uncoordinated players will not only get lost, but also lose track of one another, as they drown in the enemies here. And remember, one touch and it's over. Added to this, there's even armored rats that guard the spots in which you need to place the barrels. Only on the day of writing this did I find out that Carillion's Shade class is an antidote to this toxicity. She can just grab a barrel, turn invisible, and place it without the enemies even realizing. It's a godsend, and probably sorely necessary on higher difficulties. Winds of Magic is the single most hated piece of content in the entire game. It off the rat, comes with a heftier price than the other DLCs and promises entire new game modes, enemies and experiences, as well as weapons. And at first, all seems well. We start an introductory mission called Dark Omens, which gradually gets us to know the different kinds of new enemies, the Beastmen. These demonic, furry minotaur-like people are armed with flails and spears in their gore and ungore versions. They work very similarly to the rats and northerners. They may also, of course, try to push and stun you. They also introduce a unique kind of horde enemy that uses a bow to attack you from afar, usually coming in pairs of 3. I think this is an excellent idea. I don't see anything wrong with introducing weaker ranged enemies whose shots are more easily dodged but can be threatening in groups. The Beastmen elites come with the Bestigor, an axe-wielding armored foe that will try to storm the first player they see in order to knock them off their feet, and the Flagbearers, which power up nearby beasts once planting their flag. They will guard it as it needs to be swiftly destroyed and can be done so best through melee attacks. Lastly, it also adds a new boss in the form of the Minotaur, which is healed and profits off the Flagbearer's flag and can charge at players with devastating fury. The mission itself is a delight, and one of my favorites in its simple yet cinematic presentation. The weapons that come with the DLC are also simply unlocked after completing the mission with each character. So then, what is the problem with Winds of Magic? The problem stems from the so-called new weaves. This new mode was meant to introduce new challenges of varying difficulty on different maps or variations of a map together with a modifier such as dead enemies spawning seeking missiles and the such. The trouble begins when you consider how drastically this splits up the player base. With all other DLCs, you could at least encounter other players and play the DLC missions with them without owning them. The weaves in themselves also are all different matchmaking queues since there are so many difficulty levels and modifiers. And the last nail in the coffin is the fact that you can't use your weapon and equipment in this mode, forcing you to grind for exclusive items that can only be used here, even segmenting progression through this. Overall, this DLC is absolutely disastrous through this, and the only one I can absolutely not recommend. While the others are all an absolute steal at their price point, this one is overpriced for what it does, and I can only recommend it to completionists looking to get the full range of what Vermintide 2 has to offer. The Curse of Drakenfels was released for free over the span of 3 months at the start of 2020, finally taking us to the place we've all heard way too much about.
Yeah. And the diameter of the sun is 870,000 miles, which makes it 109 times wider than the Earth, and 333,000 times heavier than the Earth.
Shut up about the sun! Shut up about the sun!
These missions come with their own collectibles in form of wine chalices, hidden all throughout the levels, which feel fun and rewarding to find, and provide some varied and fantastically weird structures. From little villages, to churches, to rat camps, to Castle Drakenfels itself. It all culminates in a truly fun and unique boss fight, with its own patterns and hazards to learn. Overall, I can't believe this is free, as it adds so much richness and variety to the missions at your disposal. The Grail Knight is the first DLC class to be added to the game, and a surprise to me in many ways. I really did not expect to like it as much as I did. It adds a 4th class for Marcus Kruger in the form of a hearty knight, fully equipped with 2 melee weapon slots, holy great swords and shields. Originally, I wasn't interested in playing this class, as I usually find knights boring and my friend had already picked it up. But when I actually got to try it recently, I was fully convinced. The Grail Knight has probably the most unique passive in the entire game. From the start of a mission, he will display quests for his team to complete. These can range from slaying a number of special enemies, elites, bosses, or even finding tomes and grimoires. The rewards for completing these are powerful, such as a 10% increase in power or damage reduction for all. Not only does this alter the very feel of a mission from the start, giving everyone more specific goals to work towards, but it will also reward knowledge of where to find collectibles in a fun way. Kruger's ability is the Blessed Blade, summoning a giant shining sword and holding up high as long as you keep the button pressed, to crash it down once you release it, devastating everything in front of him. What makes this class fun, the many inherent synergies and stat increases it provides, since you also deal increased damage to an enemy each time you strike them for the first time. You are able to truly nuke a boss by boosting your power and charging up your ult before striking them down. In short, this class not only conveys a massive amount of power to the player, but is also unique enough to more than warrant a purchase. The last piece of DLC, until the next month at least, is the Outcast Engineer. This guy is a bonus class for Bard and Gorikson, and loads him up with an insatiable appetite for gunpowder and destruction. This premier ranged damage dealer comes with the only career skill without a cooldown, in the form of a Steam Assistant Crank Gun. This weapon needs to be manually charged up in order for its ammo to be restored. While firing, the player is forced to stand still, but this is more than made up for with the devastating power of the ability itself. The rain of fire will tear through enemy hordes like butter, as well as lay the hurt on bosses if you're able to land headshots consistently. The gameplay of this class is therefore probably the most different than any others in the game. During a fight, you're constantly forced to make a decision on which one of your 3 weapons is best to be used and when it is time to just go all in and spray your entire magazine into a rat's face. This creates a compelling, albeit stressful gameplay loop, and bleeds into his talent tree as well. Very differently than a Grail Knight, it is very much lacking in synergies, probably having the least out of all in the game. It instead focuses on providing the player with options and rewarding you for your decisions in both the trees themselves and in the gameplay. The character is a complex Swiss Army knife that can adapt to anything in the hands of a skilled player, although I'm not sure that player is me quite yet. Damn, we went over a lot, didn't we? I think you can tell that I am absolutely in love with this game. I've been playing it for around 3 to 4 months now, and it just fills me with so much joy and excitement that I haven't felt in this medium, in this form, ever since probably last year's Hades. So it hasn't been that long, but you know, it's been really fun. But this wouldn't be one of my videos if I didn't go off on a weird tangent towards the end. So, do any of you remember Overwatch? Yes? Well, how about Overwatch 2? Yeah, that one's never coming out, is it? Well, I think one of the reasons why I like this game so much is because it basically does everything Blizzard is currently setting out to do with Overwatch 2. Hell, some of the enemies shown on the preview footage of Overwatch 2 seem straight up copies from enemies from Vermintide 2. While Blizzard is currently getting lost in the size of their project, Fatshark has been consistently providing excellent 4-player online PvE content with exhilarating missions. In this regard, I truly feel as if I'm playing a game from the future. And damn, it feels good. So if you really can't wait for Overwatch 2 to come out, I especially recommend this game for you, and commend Fatshark yet again for what they were able to deliver. So, 2 more things. It felt kind of really cathartic and rewarding to be fighting the literal apocalypse in a video game while an actual apocalypse is going on. It feels like I'm contributing something to the fight against the thing without, you know, doing anything and just staying home, which is what we're all supposed to do and have been doing and are supposed to be doing for a year now. Oh, and Fatshark, you should probably look into your lead console programmer being weird on Twitter though, cause like, oh no, damn,